First, I should introduce and say a thank you to our co-sponsor, OCA Wisconsin, a wonderful Milwaukee-based organization. And Lorna Young here from OCA is going to tell you a little bit more about it instead of me just reading their mission statement. This is going to be better. Give her a round.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here with Daniel and Chris. We're good friends and have a wonderful relationship, reading books and sharing books. I am Lorna Young, and just a little bit of my own immigration history. I'm third generation Chinese American. My dad was born in Philadelphia in 1914 in Chinatown, and he was the first kid out of Chinatown to go to college. So that was a pretty cool thing to have done back then in the 1900s. And he was one of 18 children. His father was a grocer in Chinatown. My mother was born in San Francisco in 1917, and her mother became widowed in 1929 and single-handedly raised 4 children in Oakland, running a Chinese language school, which was teaching Cantonese, the prevailing Chinese dialect at the time. So I have immigrant roots. I'm realizing now that my grandparents had the opportunity to immigrate to the US despite the fact that the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was in full effect. So I find that to be amazing as I look at my own family history. Right now, I'm president of the board of directors of the OCA Wisconsin. OCA stands for Organization of Chinese Americans, which has been around since the 1980s. The actual national group that we're associated with is in Washington, and they have 35 chapters throughout the US. The chapter here was formed in the 1980s, and the organization is dedicated to advancing the social and political well-being of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the nation. That's the mission statement that he didn't want to read, but okay. But I had to read it still. But what is cool about our members is that they've been part of the Milwaukee's community throughout the 1900s, ranging from local businesses such as laundries, restaurants, and grocery stores to engineers and educators in our K-12 schools and colleges, et cetera, musicians, et cetera. I'm so happy to be able to welcome Steven Schwankert, the author of the 6th book that was just published this April. And he was a lead researcher also in a 2021 documentary, which I've sort of referenced in the handouts that are on your chairs. So if you want to see that, it's available to you through the different streaming services. And then we're very excited to have as his card and for his conversation partner, Tom Fong. And maybe you're already going to say this, but he's the son of one of the 6 Chinese survivors of the 1912 sinking of the Titanic. And he is from Janesville. He owns the Cozy Inn in Janesville, which is known to be the oldest Chinese restaurant in Wisconsin. So we have a bit of history as well, because OCA has a number of members who, when Tom was a kid, knew him as a kid. They went to church together in a car or whatever. They have all these memories. And little kid memories. And I want them to stand up and say who they are. Anna Wong. This is Anna. And Betty Chan. Yeah. And Val Ko. So this is sort of a reunion for them back from, and then he moved on to Janesville after he, with his mom. So we're excited to hear about the story of the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic in 1912, which would not have been possible without Steve Schwankert's relentless research to pursue the real story of these survivors for many decades. And while the shipwreck did occur over 110 years ago, it is incredibly timely to hear about it now. The 6 Chinese survivors were sent away from the shores of New York City due to the Exclusion Act. And today, we are entering another potentially dark time for all immigrant communities in the US with the recent news of the revocation of visas from Chinese students and others who call the US their home. I appreciate Steven's valiant effort to bring this story to light. It was a hidden story and an unknown story, and he is making visible what otherwise would have been invisible. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorna. And again, thanks to OCA Wisconsin for co-sponsoring this evening. Yeah, you blew through all my notes right here, but that's okay. One thing I have to do before we begin is to tell you that today is day 5,901 that Boswell's been here and been in business. And we're really excited to spend the evening with Tom Fong and Steven Schwankert. You know all about Tom now, which is wonderful. And happy reunion, everyone. That's awesome. Let me tell you just a couple other notes about Steven. He's also author of Poseidon, China's Secret Salvage of Britain's Lost Submarine, Beijing and Shanghai Guidebook. He's also the co-creator of the documentary The Six, as well as, of course, the book that some of you have in your hands. And by the end of this evening, you'll all be clamoring to purchase and have in your hands. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, as well as the East and South Asia chapter chair of the Explorers Club. And his writings appeared in the South China Morning Post, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Please give them both a warm welcome.
Good evening. I want to thank you everyone for showing up to come here, and I'm really happy to see a lot of familiar faces. So thank you very much.
Well, hello, Milwaukee. This is not my first visit to Wisconsin, but definitely my first visit to Milwaukee. So it's wonderful to be here. And thank you to Chris for that, and Lorna. Lorna, where are you? Hey, Lorna, for that wonderful introduction. And yeah, so it's kind of nice to be on stage with a real life Titanic descendant and my friend Tom Fong. So let me set up the story a little bit for you, and then Tom and I are going to go back and forth. He's going to talk a little bit about Milwaukee and his history and his discoveries and our discoveries and how we came together and maybe what the story means for everybody. So you heard my name already. I am a native of New Jersey. I spent 25 years in China as a reporter and a writer. I was mostly based in Beijing. It's Beijing, not Beijing. There's no French J in it. And being a product of the Jersey Shore, I always grew up around water, always loved water, was always fascinated with what was on it, in it, underneath it. And so to me, shipwrecks were always something that was in the backyard. It was like oak trees and things like that. It was just, to me, there were always shipwrecks around. It was always part of my consciousness. When I was a kid, I used to, Disney was on at I think it was 7 o'clock on Sundays. But Jacques Cousteau was after that, and Jacques Cousteau was so much cooler than Mickey Mouse. And even from the time I was 3 years old, I told my parents, I want to do that. What's that? Whatever he's doing, I want to do that. So I just always grew up with that love of the water and of the ocean. And then when I was about 14, I got the China bug. I went there with my mother as part of a tour group, just a tour group. The door was kind of creaking open then, and so I got this chance to go. And by that point, I had kind of shied away from marine biology. It's going to be a little bit too much lab work. I was afraid to find out. And so as I started to head towards journalism seemed like a nice way to learn without having to go to school. So I started to gravitate towards that. And then when I went to China, I thought, wow, this is going to be the best story going for as far as I can possibly imagine, which was until I was about 18. But it was just obviously going to be such a great story. And so from that point, I pivoted and just thought, well, I need to learn to write. I need to learn to speak Chinese and so forth. So I finally ended up there in 1996. And then I was only there about a year or so when I met someone who was similar in character to me, an English guy named Arthur Jones. And Arthur Jones had come from sort of a fine arts documentary background, but was also working as a journalist. Excuse me. We started to work together on a magazine that was published in Shanghai. And then later on, we were both correspondents for Variety. I was the Beijing correspondent for Variety. He was the Shanghai correspondent. And so we, saw each other from time to time, whatever. And then I started to work on a book about I started to work on a book about a submarine that was lost off the Chinese coast. And I knew that I could write about it, but I thought, wow, this would kind of make a nice documentary. But I don't know anything about how to do that. When I take selfies, like somehow I end up not in the frame. So it's just not my skill set. And so Arthur and I went to Arthur. I said, well, you're British and it's a British submarine and maybe we could work on this. That turned out quite well. And then at the end of that, he made a documentary. I wrote a book. We were very happy with it. It didn't make any money, but didn't cost us much either. And we said, okay, that was great. We have a nice partnership. Let's do something else. Now, Arthur has no innate interest in maritime history, but I had this whole list of stories I wanted to work on. And I said, all right, well, for our next project, it's great. I have a great Shanghai shipwreck we can work on, big disaster, big mystery to solve. We can take, the metro to all of our stops. Let's work on that. And he said, okay, that's great. But how are we going to tell this to an international audience? Like, they're not going to understand the China background. They're not going to understand the disaster background. How's this going to work? And I said, no problem. We're going to compare it to Titanic. And that was sort of the moment where, unbeknownst to us, we started to shift towards a Titanic story. In doing some of the initial research, it was just a story that I know that I was aware that there had been Chinese passengers on Titanic, but if you had looked at the page on Encyclopedia Titanica, which is the website to go to if you're into Titanic, there just wasn't a lot there. It was, Chinese sailors, and it was really like a UFO sighting. It was really like a ghost story. Like, these men had kind of appeared in the same boat as Titanic's owner, and one of them had been rescued from the water. And, it was really just kind of like Bigfoot walking through the background. And it was like, oh, okay. But there wasn't enough there, and you'd kind of click on to the next subject. And then this time when I went back and I looked at it, I thought, but why don't we know more about the Chinese passengers? By this point, the 100th anniversary of the sinking had come and gone. And I just thought for sure that somebody would put up their hand and say, my grandfather was a Chinese passenger on Titanic somewhere in the world. After the 1997 James Cameron film, everybody in China knew the story. Everybody in China knew what Titanic was. So it wasn't like it was only a Western story at that point. It was really a global story. Excuse me, I just couldn't believe that nobody had gotten into it. So, I very slowly, I managed to convince Arthur that we were working on the wrong story, which is, try that with your creative partner sometime. By the way, we're 7 months down the track and we're doing the wrong project. So I don't recommend it. But in this case, it just made sense. And the other thing was, we thought, if we don't do this project, if we don't do the Titanic thing now when we have the chance, somebody else is going to find it and somebody else is going to do it. And we're going to have to line up against the wall and take turns kicking each other in the rear end, But I said, this Shanghai story will still be there. This one we've got to go do. So, we set off, and we started off with there were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic. Okay. They were passengers. They were fare paying passengers. Okay. One of the few records that we have of them is ticket 1601 from the White Star Line. So we know that they were fare paying passengers. Did they pay their fare or did their employer pay their fare? Good question. We're not entirely sure, but they were not stowaways and they were not members of the crew. Now, they were professional mariners. They were professional seamen, but they were not part of Titanic's crew. They were, in today's parlance, we would say they were being seconded. So in other words, they worked for the UK division of this shipping line, and then they were being sent over to the US. Obviously, the Chinese Exclusion Act is in effect. They're not allowed to work in the US, but they can work on a ship that's going up and down the coast. Okay, so that's why they were on Titanic. So we saw that out of the 8 of them, 6 of them survived. Well, that's a small sample size, but quite a high survival rate. So that was really interesting to us. 4 of the 6 get off in the same boat as J. Bruce Ismay, Titanic's owner. Okay, well, how did that happen? And then of the other two, one of them gets off in another lifeboat, and one of them is plucked from the water, floating on wreckage. Gee, that kind of sounds a little bit like that Jack and Rose ending. Um, did did one inspire the other? So all of a sudden, these people that we'd never heard of before, we're really interested in them, and we feel like they're pointing us toward different parts of the Titanic story. So at that point, we committed ourselves to doing 90 days on it. We're going to do 90 days. And one of the first things that we looked at was the passenger list, was the survivor list. Okay. So 6 of them survived, and one of the names on that list, and the person always identified as being rescued from the water, was Fong, F-A-N-G, Long, L-A-N-G. Okay. Now the names were a little strange to us because, Arthur and I both speak and read Chinese. We've both been in China for a while at that point. But all 8 names, whether passengers or survivors, but all the names it was only 2 names. In other words, it was only a surname and a given name. But in 1912, Chinese people generally didn't have names that were only 2 characters. It's very common now. But then it was, you'd have a surname, a generational name, and then a given name. And all of these, if 1 or 2 had only 2 names, okay, that's fine. But so we're trying to decipher, like, well, where did these names come from? Did they come from some kind of travel document? Do they come from, did the men just walk up to the counter at the White Star Line and give their name, and some clerk is writing down whatever they hear? Where did these names come from? What can they tell us? Can they tell us what dialect or what language these men spoke, and therefore what part of China they came from? Probably in 1912, they're not Northerners. There's not that labor migration is not really happening in that way. We're just trying to tease anything out of these names. So, but this name Fong Long was always associated with the passenger that was rescued from the water. And we didn't know how these names got associated with different characters, but we thought, all right, well, this is pretty interesting. Now, if you, like I, had gone to my shelf and pulled down the 2 DVD set of Titanic that I had at home and put in the deleted scenes and the extra material, then you would have seen that there is a deleted scene from Titanic in which a Chinese man is rescued from wreckage, from the water. So at that point, we knew that James Cameron knew about the Chinese passengers, and he knew specifically about Fong Long and his rescue from the water. So all of that really kind of started to electrify us. And here's Tom Fong. So Tom, tell us a little bit about your connection to Milwaukee and your family and your father's connection to Milwaukee.
Well, I was born here, and my father, when he left the ship, he went straight to Chicago, but for some odd reason, he came here to Milwaukee. And so from my understanding from through you, he was bouncing back and forth from Milwaukee to Chicago, Milwaukee, Chicago. So I ended up being born in Milwaukee, and he worked here for many years, and then he lived in Milwaukee till later in life when he was elderly, and then because of his health, so he ended up moving back to Chicago, closer to relatives.
And you grew up here in Milwaukee?
But I grew up here, and I recognized quite a few people here.
Until you were how old?
So about 14,
okay.
Then I moved to change.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So one of the challenges that we faced, so we as we tried to work with the names, one of the things that as we tried to work with the names, finally we were able to, via the Bristol archives in the UK, we were able to get the shipping records from the shipping line that the men had worked for. Now, originally we thought, well, maybe they're a crew, maybe somehow they're related, they're all from the same village, something like that. We found that was not really true. That was not really correct. Some of them had worked together on various ships before, but they were not, it wasn't like, okay, you 8 guys, you're going to the US because you all work together. That wasn't really the case. One thing that the shipping records did give us was finally we started to get Chinese names for the men. And that was critical because once you start looking at names and you find there are a lot of alams on different ships, and, you know, Chung Fu was one of the names that we had, and there were too many of them. And, you know, just the similarity between many of these names being unofficial names, it was just, you know, it was very, it didn't allow us to, you know, track them in the way that we would have liked to. So, but once we got the Chinese names, that really gave us sort of a unique identifier, obviously, that allowed us. Now, you could work with the shipping records, you can work backwards, but you can't work forward. But still, we thought it was interesting to sort of piece together where had they been, when had they started working for the shipping line, and so forth. So we really were kind of not sure how were we going to tie these men to the present. That was really a big problem for us because it took us so long with the names. They just didn't really tell us that much. And we tried to work on other parts of the project in between, but ultimately we thought if we don't have a present day anchor for this, it's going to be very difficult. And frankly, it's not going to be that interesting. So sometimes it's easier to look for people when they're also looking for you. So Tom, what was your experience in just on your own looking for your father's history?
Well, I only heard a little short snip about my father's history. All I heard was that he was saved from the water, that he clung on to a body, and then he tied himself off. But there was never mention of what ship. And then later on, my cousin happened to mention that my father was on the Titanic, and I didn't believe. But then my son, I was skeptical. So my son that evening went online and he started looking for passenger list names. And then he found the name Fong Lang. But then he also found the story about him clinging on to a piece of debris and he tied himself off. Same story that I heard as a child. That's when I was convinced that he was on the Titanic.
But he never mentioned it to you. He never
Never
said,
mentioned it.
I was on Titanic.
Never. Well, I
Did he?
mentioned it to my cousin when my cousin came over.
But did he ever tell you the shipwreck story? Did he ever-
Never. It was the story I heard was through one of his friend's daughter. I think I was around 8, maybe. And that always stuck in my mind that he clung onto a body. And then he was rescued from the water. I always thought it was in China, but never mentioned Titanic ever.
So did you look online or post in any forums asking for information or?
Well, once I believed it, I started Googling his name, and then I saw the Titanic Britannica story, and I was reading all these stories about my father. They had his age wrong. They said he ended up going back to Hong Kong, and I know that wasn't true. So I just wrote, I just posted like, you have it all incorrect because I know for the fact that's my father, and I wrote his true name at the time. So after that, I was trolled by so many disbelievers that they thought I was lying because if you really think about it, at that time, I was 40 something years old. This is back in 2003. So people couldn't relate that this could be my father because of the time gap. So then I quit I quit writing things.
So a nice warm embrace of the Titanic community. I know it well. So when we started to look for relatives, you know, we had to be skeptical. We had no choice. You know, the Titanic is just a story that people generally want to be associated with. So we went on to the Encyclopedia Titanica message boards. First of all, we wanted to see, had anybody posted anything on this? Was there an update? Had anybody else worked on it? And did they find anything? So there were some snippets here and there. Yeah, you know, little bits where the story had been updated, but there was nothing major. But then we saw a post from someone who said that his father had been on Titanic. We thought, well, this is kind of interesting. And then, of course, below it were all the replies I won't bother repeating. But we thought, well, this is interesting. We should talk to this person. So we tried to contact the person we now know as Tom. We tried to contact the poster by the screen name and through with, the internal messaging for the message board, and that didn't produce any results. So one of our researchers said, well, why don't we take the screen name and add at Gmail, at Yahoo, at Hotmail, at. Okay. So we wrote one email and said, so-and-so posted, are you that person? Would you be willing to talk to us? And so the emails went out, and I think 9 of them bounced back. And eventually we got a response from number 10. So that's how we first encountered Tom Fong. Now, a little bit of background. So because we were filming the documentary at the same time, so Arthur and I kind of used the same model that we had for our previous project, which was I was going to write a book, he was going to make a documentary. We were going to use a shared, let's call it database, a shared body of knowledge and research that we were both going to work off of. However, because the methodology of each is a little bit different, then the way it's carried out is a little bit different. So it was slightly awkward because for Arthur's documentary, he wanted to capture my reaction to things, talking to someone for the first time, reading something for the first time, a positive outcome, a negative outcome. So we talked that we should come to Wisconsin to meet the person who said he was the son of a survivor, but I was not allowed to speak to that person because he wanted everything to be genuine when I first met Tom and first talked to him and so forth. If you've seen the documentary, you know what I'm talking about. But even then, so it was very strange because Arthur would say, oh, I spoke to Tom and he lives in Wisconsin and we should go there. And he seems very nice. So I have no input. I'm trying to, put this story together. I have no input, and I really don't know anything about Tom. And I had to look on a map where Janesville, Wisconsin was. I'm sorry, Jersey, But so I was in. I remember that first trip. I was in California for business. Arthur flew over from Shanghai. We rented a car from O'Hare, and we drove out. And we met Tom and his son, Steve, for the first time. And that was when we really started to put things. So what did you think about what we were doing? What did you think? I don't think I've
Well,
ever
I
heard
thought
this.
the project was going to be a small project, and I thought I was going to just give a little bit of info, and I thought that would be it. But then you kept coming back to me constantly, every now and then, and Arthur Jones would leave voicemail messages wanting this, and see if I could find this for him. So it was a long, long journey. 5 years, I think it's like 4 years. 5 years.
At least, yeah. So Tom, what was your father's given name?
Fong Win Sun.
Okay. So when we come to Wisconsin and we come to meet Tom the first time, we have some basic background. My father had been on ships, had been in a shipwreck, but we've got these two names. We've got this one name, Fong Long, and then we've got this other name, Fong Wei Sun. And Tom had told us, no, I never heard my father use the name Fong Long. I don't know anything about that. So we start to, we're skeptical, but we're skeptical because we have to be skeptical. You just have to assess. We did have a couple of experiences where we met with other people who said, maybe my uncle something, blah. Or, we had this one guy and he was from North Carolina, but his wife's mother said that her father or her grandfather had been on Titanic. But the problem was that they didn't really believe it. That was the thing. It was just kind of this stray rumor in their family. and you know, her husband would say, "You're crazy. He was never on Titanic." You know, and it was just this kind of weird back and forth. And it was a little bit of a soap opera, and that was amusing, but it doesn't work well when you're doing a documentary. Yes.
But what you just said, remember what my mother said? I was crazy when I told her that, you know, we discovered that my father was on the Titanic also. My
Right.
mother in the documentary said I was crazy too.
Right.
Oh, same reaction.
Right. So he never said anything to
No,
her either.
no.
Yeah. So, but you know, we didn't really find this to be that strange or out of the ordinary. When, you know, when we did Poseidon, all of the survivors were gone, but we interviewed a fair number of, you know, children who were older at that point, and in some cases grandchildren. And, you know, these were all, you know, English people, Caucasian English people, and we had the same experience. Their fathers never talked about this incident, whether they had survived or, you know, no matter what. Well, obviously, if they didn't survive, they didn't talk about it. But you know, they just didn't. It wasn't even like the hero. He didn't talk about it that much to his family. So to us, one generation not talking to the other, that really didn't surprise us. We didn't find that to be so out of the ordinary. So we came to Janesville, and it was lovely. And you know, we met Tom, and Tom showed us a lot of family photos. Really everything that you had. I think, you
Yeah.
know, just out came the
Right.
box, and we got to see all kinds of family photos. We did see that there were photos where he appeared with two separate names. One was Feng Wing Sun, and then the other was Feng Sen. It's hard to describe, but the characters are very different. And that was a little bit of a Rosetta Stone for us, just seeing those two things. We'll get back to that a little later. But you know, and it was just sort of, you know, getting an impression of Tom. You know, how does he feel about this? How does he feel about us? Because not everybody is all that excited about exploring their family history. And certainly not having a documentary crew, you know, two guys that they never met show up at your door and say, "Hi, show us your family photos." So, you know, as I say in the documentary, as we drive away, I said, "Well, he clearly believes it." You know, that was the thing, was that, you know, Tom never demonstrated any guile whatsoever. It was just a genuine interest in, you know, learning more about his father and learning more about his own history. So what was your impression of us after the first time you met us?
I was a little skeptical. Really, I was skeptical. I was like, how much can you really find? But I was impressed, because when you told me when you first going to do this documentary, I remember Arthur Jones says, "Are you willing to do this project, no matter how ugly the story can be? It has to be truthful." So, and I was willing to understand that. So that's what I really respected, because I wanted the truth. That was the whole basic of me doing this documentary, to find the truth.
So as we got to know Tom better, as we got to know the Fong family better, and as we started to take it forward, we were faced with one critical question, one critical problem, which was, we had this real life person that we knew as Feng Wing Sun, and we knew a lot about him later in life, you know, from about 19 from the 1920s on. And then we had this sort of mythical character, you know, this person that we had only seen as a name on a list, excuse me, and through the imagination of James Cameron. And we thought, well, how do we bring these two people together? You know, now we were working on a project about Titanic. So here's a hint. It's in the name. It's going to be big. It's going, you know, it's just going to take a lot. Arthur and I made a critical mistake early on, which was, we thought we could kind of bootstrap it the way we had done Poseidon. We thought, you know, we'll get some help here and there when we need to. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We were absolutely wrong. And what we realized you know, once we got over that and got over ourselves, we realized that we needed specific genealogical assistance Because, you know, he and I are both journalists, ex-journalists, and a journalist has, you know, a certain toolkit. You know, you start with a Google search, you make some phone calls, you know, you do an interview or two, and that kind of gets you started. What we needed was we needed somebody who had a different toolkit. We needed somebody who was going to start thinking about birth records, marriage records, immigration records, what kind of immigration records. And then as we started to realize that our men drifted apart, that they didn't end up all in the same, certainly not the same place, certainly not the same country, when it started to indicate that one was in Canada and one had ended up in the US and one had ended up in the UK, and we weren't so sure about the others, we realized this is going to take a little bit more than we thought. Okay. And so even though, you know, the US and the UK and Canada, we share quite a bit in terms of language and culture and so forth. But when it comes to things like public records, it's very different. If you want to steal someone's identity, definitely do it in the US because it's so much easier. You can pick a dead person from 1930 and you're off and running, okay? But for example, in the UK, census records are sealed for 100 years. So right now they're celebrating, you know, I think it's the 1924 census record, or the 1926 census records are finally available. You know, that you can get census records, you know, if any of you have ever messed around with Ancestry, I mean, you can get census records for the US for, you know, like last week. But so we realized that we needed help to do that, and we needed people who could really identify who was who and keep track of someone over time. So of the many people that we had in our team, we had Clotilde Yap, who works for My China Roots, which is sort of like Ancestry.com, but for people with Chinese ancestry. She was based in the UK. And then here in the US, we had Cynthia Lee, who's based out of New York. And it really became a task for us to kind of put these two people together. How are we going to sew this story together so that, you know, at some point, Fong Long steps off a ship onto US soil and becomes, or kind of, you know, puts the Feng Wing Sun mantle back on. And the critical bit, I'll talk about procedure, but not results. The critical bit was we had another member of our team, a guy named Grant Din, who's based out of Oakland, and he worked with Tom to get Tom's father's A file, his alien file. And that really ended up being the Rosetta Stone because that gave us the bits that we didn't have. We didn't have aliases that he had used. We didn't have, you know, when he claimed he arrived in the US. You know, all of this was material that he filed as part of his own citizenship application. But, you know, that was really what brought it together. And you know, Clotilde and Cynthia were able to, I should have included it in the book, but there's an actual illustration following all of his trips back and forth between the UK and France and the United States and different ports. And then, you know, finally where it ends up. And it was just, I mean, it's an incredible piece of detective work for which I can take no credit whatsoever because I wasn't involved. I just got to see the wonderful results. But Tom, tell us a little bit more about your father's work. What did he do when he was in the US? What kind of work did he do?
From what I know, he worked at the Lotus restaurant as a waiter, but in Milwaukee here. It's on 3rd Street in downtown. And I think one of the gentlemen out there, we used to take the bus together and we went down to go see my father because my father used to supply us with fireworks because he went to Chicago and bring back fireworks. So that's mainly what he did for a job.
Cool. Yeah. So, so the first time that we met and went to any place that your father had lived, we saw places in Chicago, Chinatown.
Yes.
So tell us about like where did he live sort of at the end of his life? Where was he living in Chicago, Chinatown?
It was 101 and a half on West Cermak. It's right at the mouth of Chinatown. And he lived up on the 3rd floor And it was just like a little solitary room that he stayed at. But I think, because of what he went through, I think he really liked that quietness, so.
And is that building still there?
No, it's replaced. It's part of a street and it's replaced by a library there.
It's a new branch. No, it's not so new now, but it's a new branch of the Chicago Public Library right there, sort of at the entrance to
Right.
Chinatown. But we got to see it. So when we came that first time, we met Tom here we met Tom in Janesville. And then a few days later, he met us in Chicago and kind of took us around. And I think that was the only time that we got to see that building because it was just about to be knocked down.
Right.
And we were able to film it. It's funny how these things work out. I mean, sadly, we've lost quite a few people that are in the documentary and that we interviewed as part of the process. You got to kind of capture these things when you can. You have to do it when you think of it. You can't sort of wait for the perfect moment or the perfect lighting. This kind of nonfiction story is just like that. Of course, I had another amazing question I was going to ask you, and I can't think of it. Yeah, I'm going to take a quick sip of tea. I don't know, something I wanted you to tell us about, and now I can't think of it. So,
Was it the cemetery? No.
yeah, we went to the cemetery. That was nice. So what was your I mean, so what did you learn from the process after I mean, you essentially entrusted us with your father's story,
Yes.
and you cooperated with us,
All that. good.
100%. And I mean, we dragged Tom all over the planet. Okay, we dragged him to southern China, to the ancestral island where his father had grown up. We took him back to the house where his father grew up. We took him to the UK. Oh, this is what I wanted to ask you. Thank you very much. The UK, you got to meet the grandson of the man who saved your father. So
Yeah.
tell us about that experience.
Well, I don't know, just thinking about him, I'm sort of choked up right now. Because talking to him and listening to talking about his grandfather, I mean, it was his humanity which made my existence. So, and then when I started speaking to him and he gave me his photo of his grandfather, I was so deeply touched. So it's like a full circle. It was incredible meeting him.
So it was Arthur's idea. I think Tom had expressed an interest in meeting. So Titanic Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, who was in charge of Lifeboat 14, if you're keeping score, he went back. He was the only lifeboat to go back. He was the only one who was willing to go back, and because everybody else said, "Oh, they'll swamp us, they'll pull us out of the boat. We can't go back." But Harold Lowe kind of moved the passengers that were on his boat to other lifeboats, and he went back with an essentially empty boat and some crewmen to see if there were any survivors. So even then, he only picked up 4 people, and only 3 of those lived. One of them died in the boat, and one of them was, of course, the passenger Fong Long. We don't know the order. We don't know, but it certainly is possible that Tom's father was the last person rescued from Titanic. So bringing Tom, the opportunity to bring Tom together with Harold Lowe's grandson. I mean, first of all, the trip to where he lived in Wales was just an absolutely spectacularly gorgeous place. And when we were there, it was in July.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
We were in July, and it's beautiful weather, and the lighting was for the documentary folks, it was just absolute. And so I'm there, I'm just like the worst third wheel ever, because, you know, it's all about Tom and John Lowe and, you know, their meeting and whatever. And I'm still trying to like get as much as possible. Not to mention that, you know, like this is, I mean, you know, of course, by this point, I knew Tom and, you know, we'd met a number of times, but now I'm finally getting to meet like a descendant of an officer. And I thought, wow, this is going to be really cool. And of course, John Lowe said, I don't know anything, you know, which is sort of the standard response, which is not really true. It's really not true. But, you know, when you know, his house was fairly modest, but it was also his grandfather's house. He lived in the same house. There's a plaque outside that says, you know, 5th Officer Harold Lowe lived here. And, you know, to go in and there, you know, there's the buttons from the uniform and there's the log and, you know, whatever. And the funny thing was I had seen this photo that was resting on the table, and it was a photo of Harold Lowe. And I thought beforehand, I thought he's going to give that to Tom. He's going to give that to Tom. So if you haven't seen that moment in the documentary, you know, track it down. It's worth seeing. But so, I mean, in the end, were you happy with what we came up with? Were you?
Oh, I was
pleased?
I was thrilled. I mean, no matter what the story came out, I just wanted to have their story vindicated, because from all the rumors, you know, how, you know, they were told that they snuck on board and then they dressed up like women to get onto the lifeboats. So are those stories vindicated, that they didn't do anything wrong, you know? That was my whole purpose, really, to go through this story, to do this project.
Cool. I think we'll talk a little bit more. So, I mean, how does your understanding of your father, how did it change after you learned these other things about him, or after you saw more about his life? Was he different than the man you remembered, or did it reinforce who you thought he was?
Well, see, as a child growing up and watching him, I never understood certain things, but then once your story came out, it sort of answered some of the things that I saw in him, you know? It's like, he had this journal, which I wish we could have found. And I guess he had this journal, and he said to one of my cousin's mother, said that once we read what's in that journal, we would know the whole story. But we lost that journal. But I remember that journal as a child that he always kept in his pocket. But it answers all the certain things that I used to sort of question. Like, he used to, I don't know if I've mentioned it to you, but he used to do this. We would sit and he would just gaze off. And now that I realize, it's sort of like the movie with the older roles, did the same gaze. He used to have the same gaze when I used to sit with him at a restaurant. He would just gaze off. And I think he's looking back at, you know, his time back then. So.
Excellent. I think we'll take some questions from the audience. Do you need me to repeat the question for the recording? Sure. Okay. Sure. Please. Did we find the equivalent of Tom for the other 5 people? Tom's father's story was the most complete story that we discovered. We have another story from Canada that's pretty complete right up to a certain point, and then it just kind of just whacks off for no real reason. We're still kind of puzzled by that. You know, if you remember the old Leonard Nimoy show In Search Of, you know, for us, it was kind of the same thing. We tried to, you know, suggest the best possible outcomes, not the best possible, but the most complete outcomes. And you know, I was the one who saddled us with this title, The Six, and therefore forced somebody to try to tie off 6 separate stories in a 100-minute documentary. So sorry, Arthur. But, you know, in the book, it's a lot easier. I can spend a few pages talking about something, but I can't. I mean, it's tough to find people who never really wanted to be found in the first place. I don't think they were concealing themselves, but it just wasn't a time of the same sort of record keeping. You know, there are still some question marks that we have. I think we did the best we could with the resources that we had, you know, the time and so forth. And I hope that someday somebody will come back and look at it and hopefully use new and better technology to take the story even further. Please. Certainly for both of us. So in the beginning, you know, we didn't want to kind of show our hand to the Titanic community, but at the same time, we sort of needed their help. So, you know, we edged into it a little bit. And a very well-known Titanic researcher, who I will not name, sent us quite a bit of material, which was very nice, and then said, I hope you're not going to sugarcoat this for a Chinese audience. Implying that their actions were specifically ignoble and that no other outcome could be, you know, conceivable. And that, you know, we really bristled at that, because our feeling was, we're going to tell this story based on what the facts say. We're going to let the facts speak for themselves. And you know, we did things like we built a full-size model of a collapsible lifeboat and put real people in it to see what you could and couldn't do. You know, could you hide in a lifeboat? How difficult would it be? Would you be seen? You know, I volunteered to be the cold water test subject to see how long Fong Long would, you know, would be functional to try to get up on wreckage or tie himself off, or, you know, just effect a rescue on himself. You know, so we were pretty happy to let those things speak for themselves. But yeah, I mean, it was, now my relationship with the Titanic community is a little different. You know, but they weren't, you know, it's like anything else. It's like any other special interest group, you know, it's like, you know, if you collect Pokemon cards, you got to have more cards and rarer cards and better cards. And, you know, it's the same kind of thing, you know, don't show up at a Titanic convention and not know how far apart the portholes are. Like, don't misquote that distance, because wow, you're going to have an unpleasant afternoon. But, yeah, it's, you know, I appreciate that people have put the time in and done their homework and so forth, but, you know, like, enough already. So, please.
Some are very suspicious when you start calling us. Some put all their stuff in front of us. And then their kid, their grandkid called us, called the publisher. Don't publish it. Could be scandalous. But take a lot of courage. Think people here don't share your own story. Then historically, you will not, your kids will not know that. Which is very important, because otherwise people would think that Chinese don't belong. But they'd be here for 150 years. Something that I think we're always taught. And I'm grateful you get television and stuff.
Well, thank you, and I love what you said. First of all, we used your book as a source material, so thank you. There's one copy of Chinese Milwaukee in stock here tonight, so snap it up while you get the chance, and you can have the author sign it. So, but also, I love what you said about, you know, share your stories. Otherwise, you know, your children will not know their history, and it's absolutely true. You know, I understand everybody has things they're not proud of. They have, you know, things they would rather other. I get all that, but you know, after about 100 years, like, just, you know, your descendants they deserve to know where they came from. You know, they deserve to understand their history and where they came from and what their place is in it. So please, you know, and the same is true for younger people. If you have questions, now's the time to ask grandma, grandpa. You know, I mean, I'm guilty too. My aunt is 90. My mother passed away a number of years ago. And every time I see my aunt, I want to ask her, tell me something about my mother I don't know. And I always forget, or it's not the right time, whatever. That time is not going to be available forever. So, have those conversations, pull out the family album and write down names underneath photos, people you don't know, because those people live right up until the moment that they continue to live right up until the moment that nobody can identify them anymore. So, do them that favor, remember them in that way. So.
Exactly. That was one of my biggest regret. I wish I could speak to my father back then and ask questions, but I never did, out of ignorance maybe, but that's one of my biggest regret.
One more? One more? Sir. So the book has been out how was the documentary received when it was screened in China, and how will the book be published in Chinese? So the book has been out, the simplified Chinese edition has been out for a few years now. The documentary got a full cinematic release, like 10,000 cinemas. That's a real number. It's really weird to walk into a cinema and buy a ticket and see yourself on a 27-foot screen. It's really weird. I'll tell you a very quick story. So I promised myself, since I thought I'll probably never have this experience again in my life, I'm going to see the film every day that I can. Okay. So I did. And so I had both ends of the same experience. So one day I went in and I was in a city that I was not living in. And when I got there, there was nobody. It was just me. And then this big group of school kids came in behind me. And I thought, okay, don't move and they won't see you. But at the end of the film, I couldn't just get up and so I thought, all right, well, they came and saw, they paid to see the movie. So, I'll answer their questions if they, so I got up and I turned around, and it was the shock. I mean, it was like I was the girl from The Ring. It was like I come out of, it was just bizarre. And then and they had no questions, but they all wanted me to sign their movie tickets. So it was like, that was nice. And then on the opposite, I think the last time I saw it was in Beijing, and it was like a late night screening. And I sat in the back row, pretty much dressed like I am right now, which is also kind of the way I dressed in the documentary. And then there was a young couple in front of me, maybe 2 or 3 rows in front, and they had been shopping because they had bags, whatever. And at the end of the film, they picked up their stuff. The woman looked right at me, and they walked straight out. It's like, you just saw me for 100 minutes. Like, I could have been anybody. It's just like, that's how you learn humility. But so it was a critical success. People who saw it seemed to really like it. It was not a commercial success. There really isn't an art house. I mean, now you have The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru, which kind of followed in our footsteps, which was almost nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. So now there is kind of a growing market for, let's call them cinematic documentaries. The book has kind of done the same. People have it. It's out there. It's still in print. It was not a bestseller. But I mean, the story is everywhere now. That's the thing, is that you can't get away from it. And it just pops up all over the place. I mean, if anybody's read Rebecca Kwong's Yellowface, apparently it's page 226. It's just like, it just pops up. I see it all the time now. So it's kind of funny. And I think that's the greatest success. That people know the story. It's not about us or whatever. It's about them. It was always about them. And, I hope that's the way it continues to be. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tom, Steven, thank you so much for this illuminated, fascinating evening. Thank you, folks, for being here. Thanks again to OCA Wisconsin for co-hosting tonight. Thanks so much for being here, folks. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you, and I hope to see you at another event. Have a great night.